Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming on this sweltering afternoon. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Wallace Centre, and first of all to introduce myself. My name's Caroline Baum and I'm the editorial director of Booktopia, Australia's largest online bookseller, and this is my first event for the Wallace Centre, so I'm really thrilled to be here with Elizabeth Gilbert. Do you want to say your little thing?
Hello. It's really nice to see you guys. Thank you so much for coming. This is a fantasy city of mine. Did you know that?
No.
I don't know if you guys walk around with extra lives planned. Like you have other selves who live in other parts of the world and I have another self who lives here and is part of this community because I love this town so much. So it's really cool to be here. And I'm in a bit of a food coma because we went a little too far at Movida this afternoon, but it was really worth it.
I thought that we would dispense with lengthy introductions because I want to spend every single minute that I can talking to Liz about the book and giving you a chance to ask questions at the end. And obviously you're here because you know and love Liz's work, presumably. Can I just get a show of hands, though, from you? How many of you have already read The Signature of All Things? Okay, so that's a fair few.
Impressive.
That's fantastic. Okay,
Thank you.
That's going to be helpful in terms of navigating. No spoilers, I promise you. I was trying to think of some things that I could tell you about Liz, though, that you might not know. One is that she's very active in social media, and she has some fantastic boards on Pinterest. So if you are interested in having a look at some of the visuals that give you clues to the research for The Signature of All Things, there are absolute treasures there. There are photographs of moss. There are little slippers that Prudence might have worn. There are books that Liz read. There are pictures of all sorts of botany references and things. So I do recommend that you go to Pinterest because there's just a whole wealth and a whole other dimension that you can discover there. Interestingly, Liz also has a sister who is a writer, and sisters do figure prominently in The Signature of All Things. We may have time to come back to the theme of sisters. We may not. Probably the most important up-to-date news is that you may or may not know that last week Liz was shortlisted for the Wellcome Award in the UK, which is a prize for medical science writing. And The Signature of All Things is the only novel on this very distinguished shortlist where Liz sits alongside authors like Andrew Solomon and Oliver Sacks. And the prize will be awarded on the 29th of April, and we are keeping our fingers crossed for you. Now, despite the kind of love in the room, I also want to address, first of all, what I think of as, if not a very large elephant in the room, maybe a small elephant in the room. And that is that I think that somewhere along the line, with the birth of this book, there was a problem of prejudice. And that there were some people who looked at the book and thought, oh, she wrote Eat, Pray, Love, I don't want to read what she writes. And then there were other people who love Eat, Pray, Love, who thought, well, if she's written something that's literary fiction, that's not for me. And it took a while for the word of mouth to spread that this was a book that would engage everyone's heart and everyone's mind in the way that it does. So can you just talk a little bit about that prejudice? Because I know you've faced it, you're aware of it.
I didn't know people have a prejudice against Eat, Pray, Love. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to leave the stage in tears now. I've been so sheltered. Do you know what? It's a funny thing. There are different ways that you can handle that, I think, when that happens. First of all, may I begin by saying that this is the epitome of an example of a champagne problem,
Yes. First world problem.
Like beyond even a first world. The world is a terrible place full of horrible misfortune, and this does not qualify in anybody's imagination as a horrible misfortune. It is a puzzle for me creatively, and I knew it would be as soon as Eat, Pray, Love became Eat, Pray, Love. The puzzle was, what do you do next? How do you manage what people are thinking about you? Whether Eat, Pray, Love sort of became a giant projection upon which people threw their most passionate emotions, ranging from adulation on one side to, contempt of the greatest sort on the other. And I'm the guy in the middle of that, trying to figure out how to make sure that my writing, which is the most important thing in my life, survives my success. And what the magical thinking that I came up with to finally make it okay to do whatever I was going to do next and have the outcome not matter that much, is that there's a great freedom, if you think about it in the right way, of having people already have made up their minds about you, because then you are under no pressure whatsoever to transform anybody's opinion, because you cannot. So don't even try. They've already sort of logged in their opinions, their whatever they've decided. That means go be whatever you want, do whatever you want. So I wrote the book I wanted to write.
But what about the woman who left the message recently for you on Facebook?
On Amazon.
On Amazon.
As an Amazon review, which I do not go in there. But my husband, who's very protective, keeps an eye on it. I don't know what he thinks he's going to protect me from by keeping an eye on it, but he just feels he should know what's going on. And apparently, a couple weeks ago, a woman wrote a 1-star review of The Signature of All Things on Amazon, saying, this is not a 1-star review because it's not a great book. It's a great book. This is a 1-star review because I am appalled by the scandalous thing that has occurred here. There is no way on earth that the author of Eat, Pray, Love could have written this book. She does not have the talent or the intelligence to write a book like this. Clearly, what has occurred is that a very talented young novelist wrote a book, and the publishers knew no one would read it, and Elizabeth Gilbert wanted to have the credit, and the conspiracy theory was, so she had it all laid out how it had happened, and she was appalled, and said, I certainly hope that someday this comes to light and this kind of thing stops happening in the publishing world. And I was like, what amazes me is the certainty, Like, let me lay it out for you, how it's going. So after having worked for 4 years on this novel, it was a little galling to be told that you didn't do it.
I can imagine.
It's like, where was I for all those hours then?
Now, last week you launched the Wall Street Journal's book club online, and you did so with Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, and you said, with the same kind of certainty in a way as your Amazon 1-star woman conspiracy theorist, that this is the greatest book of all time, bar none.
I didn't
for
say
you.
all time.
Oh,
I
really?
said of the century.
Oh, okay.
Which is still young.
Okay.
Of the last 14 years.
Of the last 14 years.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether you would like to say something about why you feel so passionately about that, but also in relation to one very specific thing about your work. I think that when you started writing The Signature of All Things, you were worried that by writing a historical novel, you would write something that would be too candlesticky. And you saw that Hilary Mantel avoided that, didn't you?
Yeah. I had begun research on this novel. I knew I wanted to write about the 19th century. I knew I wanted to write about botanical exploration. I knew I wanted to write about a female scientist. I had the sort of general elements. I knew that it was going to begin with Captain Cook's final voyage around the world. It was going to be about commerce and about the evolution debate and all the sort of big ideas of the 19th century. I knew I could do the research because I love it, and I'm sort of a librarian at heart, and a sexy librarian. No, I'm just kidding. I don't. But what I didn't know, because I've never written anything set in the past, was whether I could convincingly tell a story that was set in that time without it just reeking of somebody trying to affect a fake 19th century voice. And about 2 years into my research, I read Wolf Hall, which is just stupendous on its own merits. It's a towering achievement, and it's glorious, and a difficult one, because she's writing about material that we all know about Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn and the Tudors, and you just sort of feel like, what new can possibly be said about this? And then she unveils this, dark Machiavellian tale of power and politics that's so fantastic. And what she didn't do was more revealing and instructional for me than what she did do. What she did not do was try to write a novel that pretended it was written in the 16th century, because that would have been incredibly irritating. What she did was write a contemporary novel that happens to be set in the 16th century. So she sat in her moment in history and wrote about the past, and and I had to read it twice to figure it out, because I was really sort of trying to dissect how she had done this and made this so fresh and so vivid at the same time as making me believe every word of it. And once I caught that little clue, I realized all I have to do is write this book from the perspective of myself here now. It's just that I'm telling a story that happens to have happened 150 years ago. And make sure that I don't use any language that didn't exist then. But don't go too far out of my way to try to sound like I'm pretending that this was a lost George Eliot manuscript that I found in a cabin when I was hiking.
But what you do, I mean, one of the great sort of achievements of the Signature of All Things is the way you wear your research so lightly. So whether you're telling us about the pollination of vanilla or the beginning of the pharmaceutical trade in quinine, it's so beautifully embedded into the narrative that we don't feel like we're reading a footnote that's actually, you know, in the narrative. How do you do that? And at what point do you work out how you're embedding the knowledge and how much to tell us and how much not to tell us?
Thank you. First of all, I'm glad to hear that. One of the things that I think we've all read books where the author spent 10 years doing research and then we all must pay. You know, now you will be punished for how hard I worked on this book. You know, I think I didn't want to do that because I don't want to punish anybody for my own interests. You know, I want to entertain and engage people in my own interests. And the only way I could think to do it was the only way I've done any of my books, and it's the only writing trick I have. And I give it out freely. If you can use it for any purpose, it's yours. It has worked for me for years. It's something that my sister taught me when I was in college. She taught it to me about research papers, but it works for everything. And the rule is you never sit down to write a word of anything until you know precisely who you're speaking to, and by who. It is not like a demographic. It's not, you know, women between the ages of 20, because that's not a person, right? You have to choose somebody who you know in your life and tell that person, and only that person, the story. And each one of my books has been written to a different person. So I wrote Eat, Pray, Love to my dear friend Darcy Steinke, who's an incredible novelist and who had been through a divorce and was on a spiritual journey. It's essentially a letter to her. And it brought forth the intimacy of that voice. And I wrote this novel to my 4th grade teacher, Miss Sandy Carpenter, who was somebody who had opened up my intellect, who was a brilliant woman, the first feminist I ever met, who now is 72 years old and living in Montana with her super hot younger husband, skiing every day, and one of the most voracious readers of quality literature I know. She's somebody who will still, at the age of 72, call me up and scold me that I hadn't read The Goldfinch yet, you know, or say, "Have you read The Luminaries?" You know, like, you need to. You know, you have to participate in important books. And she's also an incredible gardener. And she was somebody who taught us about plants when I was in school. So every moment where I had to decide, does this go in or does this not go in, the question comes down to, does Sandy Carpenter want to hear about this? Or does she not? Would she think this was amazing, or would she think this was boring? And she's a very fascinated person, so it gave me a huge breadth. But she's not endlessly patient. And so I wanted to make sure not to bore her, and only to delight her and to inform her in a way that she would like.
When you're writing a novel, though, for your teacher, your venerable teacher, it's fine to decide that you're going to write a book about moss. But at what point do you decide to test your teacher by writing a book about moss and masturbation?
That teacher I could totally do. That's not a test. Okay. Yeah, she's her only criticism with the book was that she said to me, it just broke my heart that she never got properly laid. You know, so she was fine with it. You have to choose your audience very carefully.
Well,
if I'd written it to your mom, I think I would have done very differently.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
What did your mom say today about it? She said, it's just gotten very peculiar, this novel. Something very peculiar is happening.
I said to Liz when I first read the book that I thought that this combination of moss and masturbation could create a new hybrid word, so we call it Masturbation. When you were creating Alma, you actually researched the lives of what were called lady botanists in the 19th century, and you found that they had three things in common, or that women who were able to lead successful, meaningful, independent lives as scientists or investigating something with purpose, had three particular criteria that they shared. What were they?
This is a general rule, but it basically works. And if it wasn't three, it was two out of the three. They were independently wealthy. They were married to or related to or the daughter of or sister of a prominent man of science, so that they were surrounded by scientific ideas and also had entree into scientific worlds. And they were childless or spinsters and childless. And it seemed like the obstacles to a woman being able to live any kind of an investigative life were so huge that if you didn't have those advantages, money, I've said that there's a level at which money is its own gender. Because when you read about the great Victorian lady travelers, they all tended to be, they had enough money that they could kind of buy their way around the obstacles that were in place for women. You could become an eccentric heiress, and then you could go to Ceylon, right? You couldn't, be harder to do it if you were an Irish scullery maid, because your hours don't belong to you, and you don't have the authority or the entitlement to push your way in. So at that moment, it was,
So you, Liz, the criteria match you to an uncanny degree. You are the daughter of a Christmas tree farmer. Mm-hmm. You are of independent means, and you have no children.
Thanks to you guys. Thank you. And I have no children.
And you have no children. Yeah. So you are like the epitome of the 19th century independent woman.
I'm basically a Victorian lady botanist. And I'll tell you, you raise a good point, because another thing that this novel is in my life is a celebration of the tremendous freedom that I have as a writer in general, as a female writer in particular. Very few, look, I never expected to have any money in my life, and I got it because of the strange phenomenon of Eat, Pray, Love, and I'm incredibly grateful. And the best way I can think of to show my gratitude for that is to use that to do the kind of work that men have always done, to be able to buy myself the independence, to not have to go to a publisher and say, listen, I want to write a 500-page novel about a spinster who spends her life studying moss. Cool with you? Because they'd be like, yeah, that's so not cool with us. And I don't have to ask. I can just do it. I can fund my own research. I can buy my own time, my own hours. And I just thought, very few writers in general have had that. Glancingly few women have ever had that freedom. And the thought that I have is, don't waste it by playing small. Use it to do what Henry James could do, what Melville could, actually Melville was broke. But do what the big guys were able to do because they had those resources. Aim for it.
Okay, so those are the things that you've got in common. I wanted to explore for a moment, though, what you don't have in common, because you make Alma plain, and you are not plain. Why did you have to make her plain?
Because I think we have, first of all, because there are very few serious novels with female protagonists in general. When they do tend to exist, it's almost as though the way they are able to buy their right to have a book written about them is that they also have to be great beauties. And I object to that. I don't think that the only women who deserve to have stories told about them have to be great beauties. I also, as a female reader, object to this particular trope, which makes me nuts, which is when somebody tries to get away with this trick, which is this sentence. She was not a beautiful girl, but she did have gorgeous chestnut hair, fine white teeth, flashing green eyes, and a handsome figure. And you're like, dude, that's beauty. You know what I mean? Like, Jane Austen even does that. Like, Lizzie Bennet's beautiful, but she's trying to play that she isn't. And so she's trying to sort of have it both ways. And I feel like, commit, commit. and what would it mean in that world in particular? And I also really wanted to play with the idea of a non-beautiful woman who's very carnal, because the other thing that I dislike is that when a woman is carnal and lusty and passionate in fiction or in film, it's telegraphed in her appearance. She has dangerous beauty. She has heaving breasts. She has flashing. It's all there in her auburn hair and her blah, blah, blah. And that is not actually the biological reality of desire. Desire is not distributed that way. And I thought, what would it have been like in a time when women's sexuality was so repressed in general, to be a woman who doesn't have any of the signals that can telegraph to anybody that she has this tremendous fountain of sexuality in her? How will she reconcile that? What will she do with that? And what pain will that bring her? And what will she make of that? And what will she use her alchemy, the great alchemy women have to transform disappointment into wisdom? How will she manage that?
And of course, you also then highlight that absence of beauty and how that confers a certain state on Alma by contrasting it with Prudence, who is achingly beautiful and for whom her beauty is a burden.
Would really love to never be looked at, and would love to probably never be touched. And is burdened with a sort of Bathsheba-like beauty that drives people insane, and to play with those pairs of opposites. I also really wanted to play and explore, because it's something that I haven't seen, though I have experienced it, what it feels like to desire sexually somebody who does not return that. And I feel like there's a particular suffering that a woman feels when she has been sexually rejected, when she's exposed herself vulnerably in that way and been rebuked, that is very different from what it does to men. And I feel like we've seen in novels the story of a man who desires a beautiful woman who doesn't return his affections and how that makes him crazy. But I don't know that we've seen a lot about what that does to a woman. And having been through that in my life, the humiliation is pretty exquisite. Like, it's as bad as things get, you know? If one of the purposes of writing is to get rid of what you can't get rid of by any other means, you know, one of the things I wanted to do was to dump that on the page and sort of get it out of me, the memory of what that felt like and times when that's happened to me.
I've been looking and looking and looking for the things that you and Alma don't have in common, and I think I've hit on something. I think Alma is a wonderful woman, and I would love to meet her, but unlike you, I don't think she has a sense of humor.
She's a scientist. Sorry. She's kind of like my dad's a chemical engineer, and when you get a bunch of chemical engineers together, it's such a riot. You know, she's kind of like that, you know, and I think that she would probably be the kind of person who would love a good science pun, you know, that would leave everyone else sort of perplexed. So she's not. She's,
I imagine her being able to have a wonderful conversation with Dorothea from Middlemarch. I can imagine her and Dorothea being the best of friends.
Yeah. I'm sorry for both of them that they didn't have each other. Anne Patchett said the same thing. She said, I want to go back in time and have them be neighbors so that they could have someone to talk to.
But you do an interesting thing, I think, to make up for Alma's absence of humor, is that you have humor on her behalf, so that although you write about her with great love and affection, your tone is sometimes almost teasing. So when she discovers her sexuality in the binding room, you're very funny about how she thinks about it, and she sort of goes through that hilarious thing of, does anybody else do this? Does anybody else know about this? So you're having fun slightly at her expense.
Oh, I hope not at her expense.
But
did you feel
no,
like that?
I think you're very loving towards her, but you are teasing her slightly, aren't you?
I think so, but I hope it's, especially in regards to her sexual desire, it was very important to me not to humiliate her or degrade her, because she's so dear to me. But I think I became, I think I see her the way Hanneke de Groot sees her. Hanneke de Groot is the housekeeper who she grows up with, who's sort of a second mother to her, and who at times is exasperated with, like, lighten up, you know? But she is who she is, and she's a, you know, hopefully she's a delight for all of her pedantic questing. That's actually becomes part of her odd charm. And Ambrose teases her at one point when he's asking her questions about her beliefs about the Bible, and she just goes on this rant about how the apple in the story of Adam and Eve could not possibly have been an apple because they don't have apples it's not a native species to the Middle East, and that she's looked into it very carefully and thinks it was very likely a quince, you know, of this variety, or that when Christ talks about the lilies of the field, there's only one variety of lily in Palestine, and it's so rare that the people he was speaking to wouldn't have known it, so she was probably talking about anemones, you know, and Ambrose said, if only you had translated the Bible, how poetic it would be, you know, and there's a delight in that we can see in people who are like that, who just are so ground in the real that they can't kind of let go of that to see the poetic or wit, which is another kind of poetry.
So just going back to the research, where did you go to do your research? Because I watched a little video where you're at an estate in Philadelphia, which you used as the basis for Whittaker. So perhaps take us on a little bit of the journey that you went on once you'd finished actually doing the reading that kept you at home.
Well, it was kind of along with that, at the same time. The first place, the beginning, was the Hortus Botanical Gardens in Amsterdam. I was there on book tour, and I just had this germ of an idea to start writing about botany, and I had a day off, and I spent the whole day at the Hortus, and it's such a charming... Has anybody been there? It's so beautiful. If you get to Amsterdam, go. It's one of, I was going to say the oldest, but I don't think so, but one of the oldest botanical gardens in Europe, and it was a pharmaceutical garden, and part of the Dutch trade in spice and in medicinal plants, and it's exquisite. And I knew it would be a character in the book, and I met a tree there who I knew would be a character in the book, and had a little moment with the tree, and interestingly, kind of wrote that line down, and it was the first line I wrote down, and it's the last line of the book. So there was a lovely circle. And then from there to Kew Gardens, to their herbarium, they were kind enough to let me go there and read Joseph Banks's letters and get a sense of the geography there, because Kew is also a character in the book. And then to Tahiti, because you really have to do your research, Caroline. And whatever the sacrifice, it's important. If you're a real artist, you go out of your way. And to Philadelphia to try to find the location so that when I wrote about this mansion that Alma grew up in, I could picture just where it would have been in the city. So I went on a sort of scouting trip to a bunch of historic settlements and found just the right place. And I kind of blew it out in my imagination. The actual mansion upon which I based it is much smaller, but in my mind, Whittaker has to be kind of a world unto itself. But I know where it is on the river. I know how close it is to town. I know where the light is in the evening. There was a carriage house there that becomes a character in the book. There's a binding closet in the library that becomes a character in the book. So sometimes going and rolling around in those places, I think, is really important.
And what was the hardest part of the book to write? Was there a particular bit that was, because they've got this driving plot as well as these incredibly rich and memorable characters, was there any point where you did kind of get stuck because it feels so fluent and effortless? And
well, first I'll answer that in a bit by saying that energy behind the plot is largely due to something that I did with this book that I've never done before. I've always had to go away to work, and I didn't. I wrote this book at home, which I think is also kind of a sign of how good my home life is compared to what it might have been in the past. And without planning this, it sort of evolved that I would work all day. I have an office up in my attic, and in the evening, my husband would come upstairs with a glass of wine, and he would sit down, and I would read to him what I had written that day. And I just started because I'd written the first few pages, and I said, "Come and, what do you think? You know, does it sound right?" And he said, "Well, then what happens?" You know, and every night he would say, "Then what happens?" And I would take that, his sort of leaning forward, with me the next day and had the sense that I have to keep him in the story. It was a sort of a Scheherazade thing without the high stakes. And I wanted to keep him delighted and interested, and it kept the plot moving along. And it was also really helpful because when he's so polite, but when his eyes would sort of get heavy, and he would be doing this, I'd be like, cut those 3 pages tomorrow. But what was difficult was writing that first masturbation scene. And I balked. I always knew it was going to be in there. I had done all my research, which was really fun, on 19th century pornography and sexuality, which was a blast to research. The best part about that being that the way that they got around censorship and indecency laws was that those books were all written by learned doctors. So they were written as medical manuals about sexual or genital uterine dysfunction. And then you would get 3 pages in and you'd be like, wait a minute. You're not a doctor. And so that's the book that Alma finds. I got to make up that book. But when I got to that scene, I didn't want to humiliate her. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know how to do it without degrading her. But if I didn't have that, the rest of the book didn't make sense because her desire is so important to the story. Yeah. And I ended up taking out to lunch a woman who's a friend of mine who writes Regency romances for a living, as well as being a Rhodes Scholar and a professor at an Ivy League university. She's brilliant. And for fun, she writes 3 Regency romance novels a year, the contracts of which stipulate that she must have 2.5 sex scenes per book, 1 on page 40, 1 on page 80, 1 on page 120.
What's half a sex scene?
Masturbation or oral sex. And so she's done this a lot in historical fiction. And I told her I was sort of stuck. She gave me this beautiful advice that doesn't just work for writing a sex scene, it works for anything you're writing in fiction. She said, it's very simple, Liz, and you're making it more complicated than it is. You know this character already. All you have to do is ask yourself, what would she actually do? And then let her do it. And it was great for the whole plot to ask that question. What would she actually have done? And because I knew her so well, once I gave her the liberty to do what she would have done, and I knew once I thought that, she would totally have explored her own body. She was a scientist. She wasn't going to leave that unchecked out. She would have investigated that the way she investigated everything.
Absolutely, because in a way, by making her a botanist who's interested in moss, you sort of make her own body into a kind of a moist, interior, mossy little cavern.
It's getting hot in here.
I didn't come up with that. You know that. You know that.
Of course. And when she discovers moss, and puts her hand in there and it's sort of spongy and has its own ecosystem and its own, makes its own weather. There's something kind of familiar to her about that. And it's overlooked. And it's also, the Latin name for moss is cryptogamia, which means secret marriage. Because for the longest time, nobody knew how mosses had sex. It's the oldest plant on Earth, and they have the most primitive means of reproduction, but it's hidden. And so long, even into Alma's life, they didn't know how mosses had sex. It's not like one of those slutty lilies that just shows you. It's all done, very much underground and under wraps, and that's Alma's sexuality as well.
Indeed. Now, as the book progresses, the themes that you raise become bigger and bigger, and one of those is race. And I was just wondering whether you could talk a little bit about at what point you decided that was going to become something that you would write about, and how you decided to tackle that through Prudence and then later on in the novel from a completely different angle.
You can't write about American history in the 19th century and ignore slavery and abolition.
But Alma does, doesn't she? She sort of pushes it away. I can't
ignore it, but she did.
Yes.
And I think that's also her myopic, kind of the dark side of spending your life with your face in a microscope, is that you're not out here taking all of this in, right? And so Alma's sort of here as the century is getting darker and darker and sort of more violent, and this stuff is becoming more and more urgent. And her sister is tremendously involved in it, and which is also, you also can't write about Philadelphia in the 19th century without writing about abolition, because it was the center of the abolitionist movement, and there were a lot of people in Philadelphia who were abolitionists before it was hip, and they were not liked. Even by white people who were anti-slavery. There's a line in there that Henry Whittaker, Alma's father, is adamantly against both slavery and abolitionists, yes. Because they were kind of like the vegans of their time. People were like, shut up about we know, but like, they were, nagging and nagging and nagging. And so Prudence, to Alma, in her own sort of narrow view, she can't see that this is a heroic, moral person. All she can see is that this is a really annoying person who is constantly distracting Alma from her minutiae of studying to ask her to see the suffering of mankind.
And then Prudence becomes the vehicle for something else, so that as Alma moves towards an understanding of the theory of evolution, she faces a stumbling block that Prudence represents, because Prudence represents altruism, and Alma can't understand how altruism fits into the theory of evolution.
And you know what? That's still in debate. That question is still on the table. And Darwin died unable to feel satisfied with his answers to that. It's a stumbling block. By all rights, it should sort of be a Hobbesian world at all moments, and it is another species. And there's this weird thing there's this weird element of self-sacrifice that humans have, not only for their family members, which you can argue makes sense, but for utter strangers, which makes no sense. Throwing yourself in front of a train to rescue somebody you've never seen. A lion's not going to do that for another lion. It's it's odd. Or another species. One of the things that evolutionary biologists are so interested in right now is how hard human beings are working to save their predators, to save polar bears and Siberian tigers. We should want a world with none of them. You know what I mean? In the same way that we want a world without malaria infection, we should be like, let's make a world that's predator-free. Survival should indicate that, but we kind of admire and love, there's some weird emotional thing that makes us want to have tigers, even though the tigers do not return that to us in any way. There's this emotional quality of human compassion and empathy and love that's very odd. And Alma is so rigid in her comprehension of the world and the natural world. She just can't solve it. And it means that she never, I won't give up, I won't go too far into the plot, but it becomes a very important plot device that altruism bugs her so much.
Is that something, I was thinking about your sister, and I read about your sister. You said that you thought that she was more imaginative than you, and that you were more interested in the real world than she is. Your curiosity is about here and now. Her imagination takes her to other places. So is that something that you've sort of had to grapple with yourself?
Yeah, maybe. It's also, I think it's more that what I've had to grapple with, and I think everyone in here who has a sibling will get this, the idea that at a certain point in your family, you take on the role of the fill-in-the-blank one. So she's the smart one, she's the pretty one, she's the kind one, she's the pain in the ass one, she's the he's the this one, and there's a shorthand that everybody in the family comes to think of you as, and it can become kind of a prison, which is why people go and move to the other side of countries, so that they can go be other things besides what the shorthand of the family has cast them into. And I think when I was growing up, my sense was always that Catherine was the creative one, because she was an extraordinary visual artist, and she still is an amazing storyteller, and unlike me, could be sat down in a closet with a legal notepad and a pen and could invent a story, whereas I had to do 3 years of traveling around the world to go, and I'm not, it works, but it's a different kind of a way of thinking. And it's taken me years to just be like, well, I'm kind of creative too. I just have to find it in a different place. I can't generate it out of nowhere. I have to go smell it and read it and touch it.
So then, Liz, having written this book and done this extraordinary amount of research, what would you say is your signature of all things? What is your cosmology, if you like? Is it what Alma says towards the end of the book, when she says, "You see, I have never felt the need to invent a world beyond this world. This world has always seemed large and beautiful enough for me." Is that you?
No, I kind of still like worlds beyond this world. I'm more Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace, who is, of course, the other person who discovered evolution at pretty much the exact same moment as Charles Darwin, which is one of the most amazing stories in history, and reads like a novel. Later in life, much to Darwin's chagrin, because the two of them were seen as sort of shoulder to shoulder, the great scientists who came up with evolution, he had a lot of room and a lot of space in him for the unknown and the mysteries. And his notion, which I came upon a couple years into studying this, just delights me. His notion is that evolution accounts for 99% of the explanations of human biology. But what it cannot account for is this indefensible amount of imagination that we have. And as he says, there's no reason that we need to have brains that can invent opera, that can write a novel, that can make the music that we make, that can invent religions, that can imagine other universes. If we only had brains that were twice as developed as the next primate, we would still rule this place completely. We don't need to know how to play chess. It's too much. And we don't need to have, it's also, he felt, a sort of evolutionary, sometimes liability, how much we feel. That it can lead to depression, to anxiety, to loneliness, to terrible grief that can sometimes kind of not help you survive. And you sort of sometimes wish you didn't have because it's so intense. And he said his feeling was, that's in us because it was put in us by an intelligent source in the universe that longed to communicate with us. And Darwin was like, oh, shut up. Because Darwin was like, dude, you just brought God back into this. And Wallace wrote him a lovely letter and said, I never said God. Wallace defined himself as an atheist. He's proudly an atheist. He said, I said an intelligence in the universe that wants to communicate with us. You said God. I didn't say God. I just said something wants to talk to us, and the only way it can is if we have these sensibilities. And when I read that, I was like, I love that. It's so generously inclusive of religion or of the idea of some sort of a mystery that clearly stands us apart from what else is going on here. And I had originally toyed with the idea that Alma would love that theory, and then I was like, no, she wouldn't, never. Not the one who's sitting there saying that the apple in Genesis was a quince. Like, she can't believe what she can't see and prove, no. and it would be a disgrace for her to shift from that because it's her nature.
So what do you think that writing this book has taught you about your own creativity?
Well, it's sort of restored. Look, I've always loved my work. I don't have a German romantic relationship with my writing. I've never ascribed to something that I dare say I think is a very male idea of work, which is that you're wrestling and fighting with the muse, and that it's either it or you, like one of these, like, I kill it or it kills me. And if it's not making you suffer and making everyone around you suffer, you're not doing it right. I don't believe that. I really believe that it can be a beautiful life to spend a beautiful and privileged life to be able to spend your time in invention and creation. And I much more love what Tom Waits said one time, that he said, artists take ourselves so seriously, but all we are is people who make jewelry for the inside of other people's heads. The idea of just being able to spend 4 years making a piece of jewelry for the inside of somebody's head is enough of a gift and a delight that it just makes me want to go back to the jewelry table and make more, and more elaborate and more filigreed and more sparkling and more delightful.
Okay, there's about 10, 11 minutes left, so you've been very patient. It's getting very warm. If you've got a question for Liz, we've got some roving microphones. If you put up your hand, we'll come. Yes, we've got a lady in green in the second row. Please wait for the microphone to come to you so that everybody at the back can hear your question.
Liz, I was just wondering who your favourite character is in The Signature of All Things.
Who my favorite character is? Henry Whittaker. I mean, I love them all, and they're all parts of me, but I will say that the most muscular and exciting writing I think I've ever been able to do was The Ascent of Henry Whittaker. The first 50 or 60 pages of the book. Henry is Alma's father, and there was something that just brought me such unbridled joy to be able to write a character who is so ambitious, so ruthless, so competitive, so unburdened by the stuff that burdens me, you know, like...
He has no self-doubt whatsoever.
None, and never would pause to be like, is it fair or just that I behave this way? Total master of the universe. It was incredibly fun to write that. And I was just thinking the other night, it's odd that I didn't occur to me to write a woman who is that, but I think that would have been pressing the point a bit in the 18th century to write a woman like that. It was hard enough to write, you know, to make it plausible that it would be a man low-born who could achieve what he had achieved. But he was just such a blast. And when I finished that section, I almost got a little nervous because I thought, oh, Alma, you're going to have to bring it. Because your dad's kind of interesting, so you're going to have to be very interesting. So let's go. And then I kept him alive forever because I just didn't want to get rid of him. If I could have like pickled him and kept him alive for the whole book, I would have.
Another question. There's yes, in blue, I think.
Where did Roger come from?
Where did Roger come from? Roger is an amalgam of, well, Roger was named after a Bali dog. There's a dog, because there has to be a dog in a book. There's a dog named Roger who's a very important character in the book. And he's mostly based on a street dog in Bali who befriended my husband for years, who his neighbor had named Raja, but my husband misunderstood as Roger. And was warned by his neighbor, he's a very nice dog, he'll only bite you if you try to feed him, which became Roger's distinguishing characteristic in this book, that will only attack you if you try to feed him.
Until he meets a certain person.
Until you do it right.
Another question, there's a question over on this side, yes.
Hi, Liz.
Hey.
I work with a lot of writers whose biggest fear is to be public. So they have the dream to write a bestseller one day or have that converted to a movie that far, but they feel even at this stage they're too scared to get their writing out there. Do you remember what that felt like? I imagine you still have doses of that, but do you remember what it felt like in the very early days?
I never was that guy. Do you know, I have always wanted to show people what I was doing to a really irritating degree, I have to say. You know, like, there's a lovely line in Annie John, do you know Jamaica Kincaid's novel, where Annie John's talking about being a child and in the Caribbean and being in school, and the pleasure of hearing her own voice reading something aloud in class, you know, and I was like, oh man, I was that girl. I was like, put me in the school play, you know. I can't sing, but it doesn't matter, you know. I just want to be in the show.
Well, you said this afternoon that you thought that you were an introvert trapped in an extrovert's body.
Well, for the writing, I want solitude. So there's a sort of a double edge, but you know, I think think I've also said for years that I have the soul of a very serious writer, but I have the personality of an airline stewardess, you know? I really, like, if I didn't do this, I would be a hostess of some kind, you know? Like, your table's ready, you know? Like, and it actually makes people take you a little bit less seriously, but it also is sort of about the joy of communion, you know? Picasso said that your task in life is to find your gift, and then your second task in life is to share it. And I don't know why you would want to do something and not share it and not bring it into the marketplace. Not even the marketplace, but just into. I don't know. I'm not shy. I think that's what it is.
Relates to another bit of advice that you give on your Facebook page. There's an enormous amount of material that Liz shares on her Facebook page, a lot of quotes and sayings and things that she likes. And one of them is one of your pieces of advice to women that you repeat is get out of your own way.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Because at the moment, women are being advised to lean in, lean out. There's all sorts of leaning that's got to be done. So what does getting out of your own way mean?
To me, getting out of your own way means don't become the final obstacle after all this work that braver and tougher and stronger women faced with more obstacles than us did to clear the path for us. Don't you then become the last boulder in the road. You know, don't. It's a shame to be that. It's a shame. And you know, the Indian god Ganesh, the remover of obstacles, what I've always loved is that his purpose, he's this big elephant who has a bunch of arms with a bunch of weapons, and he walks through the world in front of you and knocks over everything that's in your way, and then the last obstacle that he removes are your own. And that's the biggest task and the hardest thing. Getting rid of all the rest of it is sort of easy compared to that. And I think that one of the obstacles that women, and this is a big generalization, but I think a lot of us will recognize each other in this. It frustrates me when I see brilliant, talented young women who are holding back the jewels that are hidden within them that are begging to be released, and that are asking every day, do you have the courage to let me out? You know, and they're like, no. And I think the thing mainly that holds them back is this fear that those jewels aren't good enough, and they're not as good as the other ones that people do, and there's a sense of your lack of perfection. And gee, I can't imagine why women after all these centuries would ever feel like maybe they weren't good enough or perfect enough. Odd. But it has to be, that is the thing I think has to be pushed against, because I've said it a million times, I'll say it till times get better. An absence of perfection in your work and ideas never stopped men from putting themselves into the world. And I don't say that as a criticism of men, because I think it's a kind of cool trait, to be honest. This idea that, well, I've never done that before, but, sure, I can drive that truck. I've never led a project before, but I'm sure I can. I've never invaded a country before, but yeah, why not? There's this entitlement. And I don't use entitlement negatively here. I just think there's this sort of entitlement that I'm allowed to throw my hat into this ring of life. And women don't seem to feel that they've got that. And I'm lucky enough to have been raised by a mother who really forbade us from becoming that way, who pushed us and pushed us and pushed us to put ourselves forward. And I remember her coaching me for my first day of school, because I was so excited about school. And I had my clothes laid out, and she'd made me a skirt that was so pretty that actually looked a little bit like this. It had roses on it, and it was kind of dramatic. And she allowed me to push her to bring me to school an hour early on the first day of school, because I simply could not sleep and I couldn't wait. And then she said, why don't you practice meeting your teacher with me? And we did this kind of role play a lot in life. And so she had me practice shaking her hand and looking her in the eye and saying, hello, Mrs. Tanner, my name is Elizabeth Gilbert, and I'm going to be in your class. And you might know my sister. She was here 3 years ago. And just to put myself there and make myself known. This was something that she really encouraged us to do. And the other gift that she gave us was to say again and again, done is better than good. A completed thing is better than a perfected, uncompleted, incomplete. See, I can't even complete the sentence perfectly. Fuck it. I'm going to say it anyway. that's the only reason I'm a writer, is because I have that in my bones. And when I was writing my first novel, and I knew that it wasn't as good as what I saw in my mind, and that I did not have the skill yet at the age of 26 to write the book that I saw. And I was halfway through it, and I was going to do that thing that everybody does, which was to put it in a drawer. And I just remember being like, I will not go to my grave with 75 pages of a novel in a desk drawer. And I'm going to finish this, and it may not be good, but it will be done. And if people don't like it, they can write their own fucking books. And that's how I've written everything I've ever written, is that way. And I encourage you to do the same with whatever it is that you have that wants to not be in you, but out here with us, because we need it.
Is there a question to follow that? Yes, there's a question there, and then we'll come to you if we've got time to do that.
Hi Liz, it's a bit unrelated, but I'm wondering how your meditation practice is going and how it relates to your writing at this point in your life.
Meditation practice? Oh, I'm so psyched that for once I can answer that question in a way that doesn't shame me. I stepped away from meditation for just a little while, just 9 years. I wrote Eat, Pray, Love. People come to me constantly for meditation advice, and I'm like, yeah, so it's good. You should do it. You should do it. It's so good for you. Really, science shows that you should, so where are you from, hon? Just what I have really struggled with it, and I knew it was good for me, and I knew I should do it, and I couldn't hold to it. And I had aborted attempts and tried. And the simple reason is because it's often too painful. And I think Pema Chodron, the great Buddhist teacher, speaks to this really beautifully, because the metaphor that she gives that makes so much sense is that we come to meditation because we want clarity and we want a still mind. There's something so attractive and appealing about that. And so we go to meditation class to learn how to be that. And she said, and that is indeed what happens. You start to meditate, and your breathing steadies, and you go on your mantra and whatever your contemplation or your considerations, and your mind, which is normally like a lake that's sort of swept by winds and pools and choppy water, calms down to wonderful stillness. And then for the first time, you're able to look down into it and see the corpses and the industrial waste and the garbage that you have spent your life very deliberately not seeing, and creating that like whipped froth of activity so that you do not have to see. And the mistaken idea about meditation is that it's going to sort of immediately make you happier, but first it's not. And it hurts, and you immediately decide that you're going to go watch Real Housewives of New Jersey instead, because it's less painful, or whatever your thing is. And so I've just struggled with it. And then I decided this is my year, because I started to go a little mad and get scritchy and impatient with people last year. I was things were coming up in me that I didn't like. And so I was like, I'm going to take this on. I'm going to get a reboot, go to therapy for another round, and sort of figure out why I'm irritated with everybody all the time, and start meditation again. And I ended up contacting a friend of mine who's this guy who's been meditating twice a day, every day, 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the evening for 30 years. He's the most disciplined meditator I know, and man, there is nothing incensey and frou-frou about this dude. He's like the last person in the world you would think was a lifetime meditator, except for that he's also one of the kindest people that I know. But he's just a guy. And I called him up and I was like, Billy, how? And after all these years, I've studied this stuff. There was just this aha moment where he said, it's really easy. You have a mantra, right? Somebody gave you a mantra? He goes, well, you're either on the mantra or you're on the thought. And that's it. Those are the only two states your mind can be in when you're meditating. So start with the mantra. When you go to your thought, just go back to the mantra. But it doesn't matter. Sometimes you can't. You might spend the whole meditation thinking that that's fine. And then other days you might spend the whole meditation on the mantra, and that's fine too. So that's all you got to do. And that's it. I think it's because I'm so ambitious that I wanted my meditations to be so wonderful and so transcendent. And when they were so mundane, I just couldn't cope. And now I'm like, Billy says it's okay if I think. And now I'm doing it again. And I'm 2 months in, and I feel a little weird like it's at 10 o'clock in the morning, I haven't done it yet. I'm starting to long for it, so I think it's good, and it's making my heart feel better, and I'm not as much of a bitch to the people who have to love me. It's good.
We've got time for one last question here, if it's very quick, and
I'll try to make it quick too. Yeah, sorry.
So it's the lady in the white.
Thanks, Liz. I just wanted to ask a quick question about your writing process and your creativity process. You spoke a little bit about the research that you did and how you sat down and wrote pages and then would read them to your husband. But I was curious to know about, the plotting process and a little bit more around, the creative process.
I think that what was different about writing this book than my first novel, which was very painful and there's kind of blood on every page of that thing, was that I didn't know how to help myself then. I didn't know how to help myself make things easier. And I didn't know how much you have to prepare. It's almost like you're going to the Olympics and you need years to kind of be ready so that the material is really, I mean, that's for a book like this especially. If you're writing sort of, I don't know, stream of consciousness, poetic stuff, it's different. But for something like this, I over-prepared. And I did notes on index cards, like about 5 shoe boxes filled with notes on index cards. I was so intimidated by what I was taking on that I did far more work than I needed to do. And I spoke to every expert, and I did the work, and I was coming, I was making notes on the plot, and I wrote a 70-page sketch of the book before I began, almost like a portrait sketch, to just sort of make sure I knew where it was going before I began. And I'd never done so much preparation on a book before. And the reward was, and the only metaphor I can think of is, if you're painting the interior of your house, what I used to do in my 20s was be like, I want to write, I want to be a writer. Open up a can of paint, take paint, and start painting a wall without prepping it at all, like not moving any furniture, not taking any of the paintings up, and then being like, oh man, there's a mirror here, there's a couch, the radiator's rusty, there's a hole in this wall, and then just getting stuck. What I did here was spend 3 years prepping this house to paint, so that when the time came to tell the story, I had one of those big roller things, and I just went like, because it was in me so deeply, and I don't think I will ever punish myself again by not preparing for the work in advance, and that way I can be in the pure joy of the creation when the time comes to it.
That's a very inspiring note on which to end. I sort of feel that in your flight attendant mode, I sort of need to say that the flight has landed, and thank you to the crew for a very smooth and entertaining flight. And now, doors to manual. Please join me in thanking Liz Gilbert.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Aww. And the great Caroline Baum, my favorite interviewer. I wish you could just come with me always.
Okay.
And now I'm going to stand in the hallway, and as you all leave, I'm going to go bye-bye, 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 bye-bye.
Let's go.